Sunday morning inside a maximum security prison on Brazil. A man in a collared shirt, guitar slung over his shoulder, is leading the chapel service. He has been doing this for 2 years already. He has legally earned the right to walk out. His own lawyer could file the paperwork tomorrow. But the thing is, he won't let him. Ask why, and the answer is that he's afraid that if he leaves, he will start killing again. That man is Jorge Beltrão Negromonte da Silveira. Back in 2012, Brazil gave him and his 2 wives a nickname that stuck: the Cannibals from Garanhuns, os Canibais de Garanhuns. I'm gonna be pretty honest right now. Cannibalism isn't even the strangest part of the story, but let's start from the beginning. How does a man go to the point where staying in prison feels safer than walking out of it? That's what we are spending the next 2 episodes in. This is part 1. Garanhuns sits in the interior of Pernambuco, northeast of Brazil, ringed by 7 hills, almost 900 meters above sea level. That elevation gets it a genuinely mild climate. Green hills, flowers in the squares. Let's say just very different from the rest of the region. That's why it's even called Pernambuco's Switzerland. Every July, the city actually hosts a winter music festival that pulls something like 500,000 visitors every year. Let's remember that Brazil is in the southern hemisphere, so winter is actually in July and the summer is in December. Let's go back to Garanhuns. It's a small town with 140,000 people, so not particularly tiny. It had a police station, courts, but it was still the kind of place that had a social radar where everyone knew everyone. And it still is to this day, actually. So let's summarize this case. This story involves cannibalism, a triple, ID theft, and child kidnapping. So, with that context in mind, it's easy to understand why the story got so famous, first in the region and then country-wise. Now, to understand the story from the beginning, we need to go back to the 60s. Jorge Beltrão Negromonte da Silveira was born in December 14, 1961, in Recife, also in the state of Pernambuco. He was the youngest of 5 kids in a strict household. A military father, let's remember the Brazilian dictatorship started in 64, and a mother several accounts described as cold, almost checked out. From ages 7 to 12, he was sent to Portugal to live with an aunt, on the theory that he'd get a better education there. At some point, however, he came back to Pernambuco, where he started studying physical education and became a black belt in an unspecified martial art, either karate or jiu-jitsu, depending on the source. Jorge's stories gets darker fast, decades before anyone had heard of Garanhuns or cannibalism. In March 1994, so 18 years before the Triples case, and when Jorge was 23, Jorge was actually accused of killing a 17-year-old named Luciano Severino da Silva, shot in the back. According to the victim's own brother, Jorge and his brothers allegedly moved the body and took the wallet, and Jorge then fled out of the state. The case only reached a verdict in October 2010, when a jury acquitted him for lack of evidence. So let's make the math here. From 94 to 2010, it's 16 years. It's important that we have that in mind because it will explain something later in this case. For right now, we can say that during his entire adult life, up to that point, Jorge had an open homicide case hanging over his head. Now, parallel to Jorge's story is the one of Isabel Cristina Torreão Pires, who everyone and we will call Bel. She was also born in Recife, into real poverty, somewhere around the first half of the 60s. Belle never finished elementary school, and as a kid, she learned to make savory pastries to sell in order to help her family scrape by. She dreamed, like a lot of kids in Brazil do, of being a singer and even got as far as a televised talent audition once. But this never went further. Belle met Jorge at a church in 1984, when both were around 23 years old. What is chilling, although very common in Brazil, especially for church-going families in small towns, is that when her father found out that they two had become intimate, he made them get married, which they did. Here is the detail though. At the reception of the wedding, and this detail only comes from Jorge's own later writing, so let's take it for what's worth. He had what witnesses called a breakdown, appearing to talk to his dead father and to his childhood friends nobody else could see. At this sight, Belle ran to a neighbor's house, scared. And then, in a pattern that's going to repeat for the next 2 decades, nothing happened. They stayed married. They tried to find salvation within. And again, as a story that is much as old as time, Belle became a homemaker, later a seamstress. The two of them wanted kids badly for years, but it just never happened. And I won't say it was for the best. The picture stayed somehow like that until 2003, when Jorge and Isabel moved to Natal, in the neighboring state of Rio Grande do Norte. Jorge at the time was 43 and picked up a work as a gym teacher. One of his students was 16-year-old Bruna Cristina Oliveira da Silva, born in 1986. By her own later account, she was the one who fell first. And I'm not going to go into the details regarding age and the power dynamic of the relationship here, because I think it is already pretty clear, but let's just say it's very problematic. And Bruna was legally a minor at the time. Anyway, let's go back to the story. Jorge told her he was married only in paper, that the marriage had become a fraternal relationship, nothing physical anymore, which Bruna believed. Here is the moment where the story gets stranger. As a listener, what I'm about to tell you, I think it's weird, but at the same time, knowing how women were treated and sometimes are still treated in Brazil, I can understand why and how. After Bruna and Jorge started dating, Jorge went to Belle, his actual wife, and asked if Bruna could move in. And Belle actually said yes. Let's remember that she also married because her father wanted them to get married. But anyway, that's the actual origin of what Brazilian coverage has always called the triple. 2 women, 1 man, all sharing a household openly, years before a triple had any real cultural currency anywhere. And what is more surprising, this wasn't a secret affair. Everyone in Garanhuns knew about it. Everyone in town called Bruna the mistress. And actually, to be fair, the press also did it at the time, and plenty of outlets still do. What kind of flattens what this actually was, structurally speaking, because it was closer to 2 committed partnerships running in parallel under one roof. It was, by our current standards, a consensual polyamorous relationship, still with many red flags. But I'm not coming from an outdated overview. I know that triples exist and don't hurt anyone. What made this particular relationship dangerous wasn't the shape. It was, first of all, that Bruna was 16 when it started and her boyfriend was over 40. That on its own is a serious problem, however we go from here. Then we also have the matter that even Jorge and Belle's relationship, the original couple, was terrible. They didn't talk, and from different accounts, Jorge was actually very aggressive. It wasn't a healthy household to begin with. Still, the 3 of them went on to build something considerably worse than an unconventional relationship. In 2005, once Bruna turned 18 and Jorge was 44, all 3 moved to Recife again, in Pernambuco, the original state of this story. At this point, with 2 wives, Jorge was certain he was finally about to become a father. But it didn't happen, not with Belle and not with Bruna. When it didn't, the official couple, so Jorge and Belle, tried to adopt a kid, but they were rejected because Jorge still had that homicide case grinding through the courts. Let's remember it ended in 2010 when he was acquitted. This adoption rejection was later pointed as one likely spark for what came next. If the system wouldn't let them build a family through adoption, they'd find another way to get one. Sometime in the years that followed, taking it over with friends back in a nearby city, Jorge came up with the idea of a cult of 3 members. Yes, just the 3 of them, which makes it, by any measure, one of the smallest religious movements on record. By the way, Jorge called it o cartel, the cartel, like we hear about the Mexican ones. Its stated purpose, per what the trio later said, was fighting population growth by eliminating people judged to be incapable of contributing to society, souls that needed purification. In practicality, young single moms were the primary target, specifically because they had already gotten kids in the world, but also because killing them meant there would be no further reproduction. Worth knowing though, according to their own statements, it was Bruna, the youngest person in the triple, who drew that criteria. Young, single women, unemployed, uneducated, with kids they couldn't afford for, with no family safety net to fall back on. A profile built, in other words, around exactly the kind of vulnerability that makes someone easy to lure and also slow to be reported missing. Let's also take a moment to think about how terrible is that concept that some people are not worth living. It is kind of the root of all prejudices. In 2007, Jorge withdrew roughly $15,000 from his mother's bank account. This withdrawal was routed, according to later reporting, through one of his siblings and used to buy a house in Olinda, a city near Recife. That's the house where this case's first confirmed murder happened in 2008. At the time, Jéssica Camila da Silva Pereira was 17. She was barely getting by with a kid just over a year old. Belle approached her with a Bible in hand, according to the account Jéssica's own father gave years later in a TV interview. Belle approached Jéssica offering her a job as a housekeeper, and this job would basically support her and the kid. It took a few days for Jéssica to accept it, but still, within days, Belle had won enough trust to bring Jéssica home. Her father never saw her again. For years afterwards, he had no idea what had happened to either his daughter or his granddaughter. Now, this is the time where the story takes a twist. Jorge and Belle, still childless, had already talked about keeping the baby once Jéssica was out of the way, which is precisely what they did. Spoiler alert. Before the killing, the 3 of them convinced Jéssica to formally register her daughter's birth with Jorge listed as the father. It had a blank space before. On May 26, 28, Jéssica Camila da Silva Pereira was killed in the bathroom of that house. Days later, Bruna, the second wife, started living under Jéssica's name. And worst part, raising Jéssica's daughter as if she were her own. Days later, the trio gave the kid parts of her mother's body to eat. We will pick up right there in part 2. My name is Nell, and see you next week.